It's quite a special place to be speaking because Merton College was a place where Tolkien himself taught from 1945 till 59. I'm sure you'll correct me if that's wrong. Yes, and during that time he of course published The Lord of the Rings. So the topic I'll be talking about will, as Giuseppe said, a small part of my PhD that I've recently completed on Tolkien's Ents. These are those walking, talking, singing, wonderful creations of Tolkien's. I've been thinking of writing about Tolkien's trees and forests for a few years now. My PhD project was funded by the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research, and this is primarily a scientific research institute. It's currently running one of the largest scientific experiments on climate change in the world in an unassuming wood in rural Staffordshire, and they're trying to understand how elevated CO2 levels predicted in the year 2050 will impact our forests. My own literary scholarship engages with questions surrounding ecology and environmental crises, but from a different perspective. I'm seeking to understand how imaginative literature can help us think more deeply about our relationship with forests and responsibility to the more than human world which forests embody so vividly. These are places where the vast majority of terrestrial life calls home, and they also, of course, store more than half of the world's carbon. That's why they're so critical for the future of life on Earth. My talk today will explore not only thinking deeply about our relationship with forests, but also thinking about specifically what the Ents might offer us today in our context of ecological crises, a time when our fate as a species and many other species has never been more entangled with the future of our planet's trees and forests. And so I'll speak about that for about 35 minutes, and around 10 minutes I've left to talk about some of the work I've been doing at the Wyre Forest National Nature Reserve, bringing the fantasy text out into an actual forest. And then we should have some time for questions at the end and a quiz. No, I joke. There's no quiz. This is a picture that some of you may recognise. It's the last photograph of Tolkien, I believe, taken on the 9th of August, 1973, just before he died, beside what is purported to be his favourite tree, a black pine, which grew in the Botanic Gardens just behind this building. Sadly not there anymore. It partially collapsed a decade ago, and it was subsequently felled for safety reasons. The local paper, Oxford Mail, couldn't resist using the headline, "The Ent is nigh" for Tolkien's tree, stating that it was the inspiration for Treebeard the Ent. But as is always the case for literary inspiration, the real story is more complex and deeply rooted than a single source. Certainly the trees grew out of Tolkien's deep passion for knowledge of and sense of kinship with trees throughout his lifetime, and the letter that's often quoted to give evidence to this is this one written in 1955, where he says, "I'm obviously much in love with plants and trees, and always have been, and I find human maltreatment of them as hard to bear as some find ill-treatment of animals." But Tolkien himself was kind of mystified about where the idea of the Ents came from. He asserted repeatedly in his letters that he did not consciously invent them, and that they were likely composed of philology, literature, and life. Elsewhere he described them as emerging from the leaf mould. a kind of decomposing mulch of myth, which includes reference to giants in 19th century Anglo-Saxon verse, the Green Knight of a 14th century Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which Tolkien translated, or perhaps the army of animate trees in the medieval Welsh poem Cad Gaddo. And I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that correctly, sorry, Welsh people in the audience. So not only can we think about the Ents as part of an ecology in Tolkien's imaginary world, I think we can think about them also as part of a kind of textual ecology, this idea of composing and decomposing, this recycling of forms. And fantasy scholar Brian Atterbury has talked a lot about this, about modern fantasy recycling earlier forms such as myth, sustaining the new growth of the literary genre by drawing inspiration up through what others have called the taproot texts. Tolkien famously described this kind of idea as the countless foliage of the tree of tales. He likens the intricately knotty and ramified history of the branches of a tree of tales to the tangled skein of language. And certainly the two are entangled in Tolkien's creative process, which is fictionalized in his story Leaf by Niggle, a kind of strange story if you're not familiar with it. It tells of an artist absorbed in painting an unfurling vista of a vast tree and becomes absorbed in it in more than one sense of the word. Or depicted here, as you can see in this illustration, is just one of many of the tree of Amelian, or as others call it, the tree of tales. So Tolkien visualized the creative process in which the entangled web of stories and language evolves as the tree of tales, and the patterns of evolution, ancestry, inheritance that he describes on fairy stories, his essay, to do with philology, which produces such stories, including his own, for he created his fictional world to situate the language that he first invented. This is where each leaf of oak and ash and thorn is a unique embodiment of a pattern. We can also associate this with Tolkien's theistic conception of biological evolution, revealed here in a letter wherein he describes his fascination with looking at illustrated botany books, which awaken him visions of kinship and descent through great ages, and also thoughts of the mystery of pattern and design as a thing other than its individual embodiment. You can see the patterns in the language here. So what better way to embody this coming together of Tolkien's interest in philology, literature and life then, than the Ents? Trees feature prominently in the mythical iconography of his imagined universe, such as the two trees of Valinor, whose first blooming began the count of time and whose final fruit and final flower became the sun and moon. More than mere symbols, however, trees are vivid and naturalistic in their depictions. He creates immersive forest ecosystems with them. And Middle-earth's forests in particular are numerous and diverse, from the vast forest regions of Beleriand to the numinous sanctuary of Lothlorien, the spider-infested gloom of Mirkwood, the ancient old forest in Fangorn, which are surviving fragments, centuries of deforestation. Middle-earth was once characterised by the elves for its abundance of trees, as a song to Elbereth demonstrates. And again, sorry, all the elves in the audience. O Galad Vremen Enerath, or from Tree Tangled Middle-earth. But looking at this map, we don't really get a sense of vast forest regions. The only really large forest there is Mirkwood, All the others have gone through a long history of deforestation. And this is kind of natural for Tolkien. So, emerging during a period in which Britain's forest cover plummeted to its lowest point in recorded history, it's ironic then that Tolkien's stories are richly forested, but they also are ones in which the vast swathes of land have been deforested and degraded, and the surviving fragments we see in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings face existential threats. In the form of the Ents, Tolkien's deep love for trees becomes embodied and animated, and they emerge as vital agents in his stories as much as they are in our lives. So let's come to face with an Ent, as the hobbits Merry and Pippin do for the first time in The Lord of the Rings, unexpectedly encountering the eldest Ent, Treebeard, in Fangorn. They found that they were looking at a most extraordinary face. It belonged to a large, man-like, almost troll-like figure, at least 14 foot high, very sturdy, with a tall head and hardly any neck. Whether it was clad in stuff like green or grey bark, or whether that was its hide, was difficult to say. At any rate, the arms, at a short distance from the trunk, were not wrinkled but covered with a brown, smooth skin. The large feet had 7 toes each. The lower part of the long face was covered with a sweeping grey beard, bushy, almost twiggy at the roots, thin and mossy at the ends. But at the moment the hobbits noted little but the eyes. These deep eyes were now surveying them, slow and solemn, but very penetrating. They were brown, shot with a green light. So physically the Ents appear as anthropomorphic trees, that is, sharing or blending human-like and tree-like qualities and characteristics. So he's more than twice the height of a human, but comparatively small to the surrounding oaks and beeches to which he resembles. His long head and kind of neck almost continuous with his torso, so more like a trunk. It's ambiguous whether its exterior is bark or covered with maybe green algae or lichen, or skin covered in fur or hair. His arms smoother than his body, that makes sense. A bark on a tree's branches is often smoother than on the trunk. It's experienced less lateral growth, so it's less cracked. His 7 toes give his feet a more kind of root-like splayed appearance. And his long beard, his namesake, begins almost like a burr, those knobbly growths on trunks which are often a mass of twigs and buds, and often a sign of age too. Except it's mossy at the ends. Again, perhaps this is the genus of epiphytic mosses, or for trichum, also known as bristle moss. The obvious difference, though, between the Ents and other trees of Fangorn is their ability to walk. I'll show you a clip of the march of the Ents upon Isengard depicted in Peter Jackson's Two Towers. And for the ambulatory Ents, this ability to uproot themselves and stride across vast distances allows them to kind of rally together and defend themselves in their forests. Tolkien remembered feeling a bitter disappointment reading Macbeth and learning that the Birnam Wood didn't actually, in reality, move across the land to Dunsinane. Real trees cannot, of course, walk, but they can collectively communicate and defend themselves as effectively as the Ents by emitting volatile organic compounds into the air to each other, which signal danger and cause neighbouring trees to release chemicals like tannins in their leaves. but repel certain insects or attract certain other insects, like parasitic wasps, to come and eat the insects eating them. Also, in a very real sense, forests are, in fact, on the move. In the past 50 years, the tree line of a boreal forest that girdles the Arctic Circle is moving rapidly further north every year due to climate change. Yet, much like the ants who find themselves trapped in a rapidly diminishing habitat, many of these tree species, like Scots pine, will soon be pushed to their limits of their range. In this moment in the story, it's not Treebeard's ability to walk, however, that fascinates the hobbits, but his eyes. Often afterwards, Pippin tried to describe his first impression of them. One felt as if there was an enormous well behind them, filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking. But their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree or on the ripples of a very deep lake. I don't know, but it felt as if something that grew in the ground, asleep you might say, or just feeling itself as something between root tip and leaf tip, between deep earth and sky, had suddenly waked up and was considering you with the same slow care that it had given to its own inside affairs for endless years. This is a wonderfully rich passage where Tolkien's anthropomorphism becomes sophisticated, I feel. And that's because the Ents appear to be ontological as well as physiological hybrids. And by that I mean, so Pippin gazes into Treebeard's eyes, right? And he imagines his experience of time. And interestingly, this experience of time, Pippin's imagination of this, is in spatial terms. So we have the tree's physical structure, the roots buried deep in the deep past, while the outer leaves are sparkling with the present day. Between the root tip and the leaf tip, is an Ents consciousness, constricting into human or hobbit scales of time, but also dilating into the profound darkness of the deep past. The idea of trees having memory isn't so fanciful as you might think. So my colleagues in BIFOR, the Forest Institute, they're working on a project which is looking at the epigenetic tree memory, okay? So the idea that they experience environmental stresses like droughts and heat waves, and they can pass on through this epigenetic memory the ability for their descendants to more easily adapt to our changing climate. And similarly, we have a sense that Ents can think and act on within and both beyond human scales of time. So, for example, Treebeard knows of this past deforestation of Middle-earth, but is also perceptibly aware of the deforestation that's happening currently with the wizard Saruman. This ability to think both within and beyond human scales of time, it strikes me that how much a better position we would be in today if our politicians could do the same. Treebeard is keenly aware that while human actions take place on a timescale that's fleeting to the forest and the ancient ants, the wider ecological consequences of these actions are far-reaching. The first question the hobbits ask when they meet Treebeard is quite naturally, who are you and what are you? And let's consider his response for a moment. So Treebeard states that he's both an Ent and the Ent. Treebeard's name in Elvish Sindarin is Fangorn, the name of the forest itself. Fang meaning beard and Orn meaning tree. But he doesn't tell the hobbits his true name in his own language, Old Entish. Given the mix of philology, literature and life from which the Ents are composed, it's fitting that Treebeard is both a storyteller and a philologist himself, stating that names are entangled with things and stories entangled with names. He says, "My name is growing all the time, and I've lived a very long, long time. So my name is a story." Real names tell you the story of the things they belong to in my language. Perhaps because he is the oldest surviving Ent, Treebeard has become representative of the Ents and also the forest in which they inhabit. A number of Ents beside Treebeard are mentioned, including Leaflock, Skinbark, Wandlimb, Quickbeam and Beachbone. Each of these names, except perhaps Quickbeam, which is another name for the European rowan, describes the individual Ent's defining characteristic by combining the species or the part of a tree with a part of human anatomy. Just as the part expresses the whole, in Treebeard's name, the common names for Ents describe how part of their anatomy, limb, lock, skin, bone, embodies and differentiates them as individuals. So what's expressed in this entangled nomenclature of the Ents and the forest itself is a kind of ecological entanglement. Treebeard, and by extension the Ents, are individual organisms, but they also, as genius loci or the spirits of place, collectively embody and give voice to the forest in which they inhabit. As a complex web of species which are interconnected, forests are places in which our normatively individualistic conceptions of life are challenged. Thinking ecologically means to think about the porous boundary of the individual organism and how it's interconnected to this wider system of relationships without which the individual would not be able to exist. And you only have to think about the oxygen in your lungs at this moment and where that's come from. It's entering into your bloodstream. Philosopher of science Peter Godfrey Smith speculates that an individual might be an organism, a part of an organism, or a larger thing like a colony or ecological system. This is quite a strange thought, to think about forests as individuals, as organisms of a kind. But this is especially true with plants, and anyone who's taken a cutting of a plant knows that where one individual ends and another begins is kind of blurred. It becomes even more challenging when one considers the physical extent to which plants and fungi are interconnected, even on a cellular level in a forest. So if you go down into the woods today and you look down at your feet, you can imagine, or at least try to, a vast, intricate, subterranean web of fine fungal threads which will stretch out beneath your feet, linking multiple plants and fungi together, both individuals and different species, and allowing them to pass nutrients, water, biochemical signals to each other, the mycorrhizal network. One of the principal scientists in this field is Suzanne Simard, who argues that the larger, older trees in the forest, which she calls mother trees, play a vital ecological role in this system, nurturing and sustaining other trees in a forest via this mycorrhizal network. As tree shepherds, the Ents play a similar role to mother trees in Fangorn, defending and caring for tree communities. There's an ongoing heated debate about the promises and pitfalls of imagining such alien phenomena in relatably human ways, such as human social relationships. And I don't really have time to go into the nuances of this debate, but I will share the biologist Merlin Sheldrake's response to this in his popular book, Entangled Life. Sheldrake cautions against projecting the human onto the non-human, while at the same time he asks, are we anthropomorphizing plants or vegetalizing a set of human concepts? In Llangorn, it's an ideal place to have this kind of experimental play of the scientific imagination, because it's a forest that's comprised of trees, Ents, and seemingly everything in between, in a way that's representative of the wider ecology of Middle-earth, in which real and imaginary organisms overlap, interact, and cross-pollinate. Fantastic and naturalistic taxa merge and morph in such creative confusion that often characters can't tell the difference between them. And we can liken the experimental taxonomy of Middle-earth to both medieval bestiaries and early natural histories in which mythical beasts and magical plants were often interspersed and hybridized with ordinary or exotic and therefore dubiously real flora and fauna. Llangorn has diverse communities of deciduous and evergreen tree communities, including chestnut, willows, birches, rowan, pinewoods, silver birches, and fir trees. And each of these tree species are distributed appropriately in different parts of the forest. So, for example, the elevation and altitude both determine the distribution and growth rate of tree species. So, for example, at the feet of great tumbled slopes, the trees were scanty, while above these the hobbits saw thickets of birch and rowan, and beyond them dark pine woods. When the hobbits are then plunged into deep groves, the trees were larger, taller, thicker than any the hobbits had ever seen before. And the density of growth at this lower elevation gives this location a stifling feeling, indicating increased air pressure and temperature. So Tolkien demonstrably had a deep understanding of tree species and their ecological distribution, but he applies this understanding lightly but precisely to paint an immersive imaginary forest. However, within this real or seemingly real ecosystem, there are the obviously fantastic creatures, the Ents. But how are exactly Ents related, if at all, to ordinary trees? And to make things even more complicated, there are also the horns, a more ominous kind of ambiguous form, sometimes animate and mostly non-verbal tree, which overwhelms the army of orcs at the Battle of Helm's Deep. Treebeard says himself that he does not understand the changing relationship between trees and Ents. In between Ents, horns, and ordinary trees are what appear to be kind of intermediary organisms, developing variously towards one side or the other on a kind of continuous spectrum of naturalistic and fantastic arboreal beings. So some Ents are going tree-ish, some trees are half awake, some trees are wide awake, a few of those are getting Entish, and this is a kind of metamorphic process which is going on all the time. And we can tentatively place Old Man Willow, whom the hobbits met previously in the Old Forest, I think, in this latter category of trees getting Entish. I argue that the coexistence and interaction between real and imaginary creatures in fantasy forests, a technique which is perhaps fundamental to this idea of world building, allows readers to test how far the forest in the textual world departs from what we ourselves can perceive in real forests around us, and can therefore be used as a perceptual tool. And I'll come on to this idea later. Treebeard has borne witness to extensive deforestation throughout the long ages of Middle-earth. We get a sense of this loss of Middle-earth's forests first in The Lord of the Rings, when Tom Bombadil informs the hobbits that the old forest that borders the Shire was not called the Old Forest without reason, for it was indeed ancient, a survivor of vast forgotten woods. Once continuous with Fangorn, the two forests now separated share many similarities. So, like Fangorn, Old Forest is diverse in tree species and age, as described that all the stems were green or grey with moss and slimy shaggy growths. And the moss and slimy shaggy growths, the latter perhaps liverworts or epiphytic lichens such as Usnea species, commonly known as old man's beard, are indicators of ancient woodland. Lichens are also found in Fangorn, where trees are described as being festooned with weeping, trailing beards and whiskers of lichen. And Treebeard, as we know, is also suitably covered with a sweeping grey beard, bushy, almost twiggy at the roots, thin and mossy at the ends. The abundance of lichen and moss that are described as dripping with moisture may also indicate that these forests are temperate rainforests. You might have come across this idea with Guy Shrubsole's recent book, The Lost Rainforests in Britain. These are forests, a very particular type of ecosystem, mainly situated on the western seaboard of Britain today, much like the ones lying west of Middle-earth in the Third Age, and these, like them, are isolated fragments. In his book, Shrubsole discusses the influence of Britain's ancient forests on Middle-earth's forests with the Tolkien artist Alan Lee, whose illustrations I've been using on previous slides, and you can see one here behind that book. As Lee tells Shrubsole, his paintings of Fangorn and the designs of Treebeard for the Lord of the Rings film series were themselves inspired by the lichen-bearded rainforest trees of Dartmoor, and specifically here's Wisman's Wood, which is a typical example of a temperate rainforest. Okay, so with that aside, however much we sympathise with the Ents for his kind of grief over the loss of the forests of Middle-earth, it's perhaps the Ents' veneration of forests above all of the types of land. It should be questioned, I feel. So scholars Matthew Dickerson and Jonathan Evans, in their book, they argue that the Ents embody a preservationist ethic towards forests. They say the Ents care for these places, expressing their respect for them by letting plants, flowers and trees grow according to the principles inherent in their nature, countenancing neither the conversion of these lands to civilized use nor the organised culture of growing things. And this is seen in contrast to what they call the conservationist ethic of the Entwives, a female variety of the Ents, who are associated with orchards and gardens, so they require an active management rather than a kind of laissez-faire, leave it be attitude for Treebeard and the Ents. Treebeard sings the hobbits a song mourning the loss of the Entwives. And Dickerson and Evans go on to say that the Ents legend of the Entwives is one of spousal disharmony, and their disagreement over the best way to tend to growing things, how they put it, a preservationist versus a conservationist mentality leads to the Entwives' departure. And we can see this kind of spousal disharmony over how to value and care for nature in Unfinished Tales, in the tale of Aldarion and Arendis. Aldarion wants to use the forests to build ships, to build his navy. He very much sees trees according to their instrumental value, whereas his wife disagrees and argues for their intrinsic value. And this kind of axiological disharmony is something that sustainable management of forests today is kind of wrestling with. How do we look after our forests? How do we actively manage them in a way that benefits biodiversity but also allows us to use them as a resource? And this is obviously an important resource that we need to make more use of going forward, instead of concrete and plastic, all these high carbon materials. Now, the Entwives are possibly extinct. Treebeard knows all too well that this means the dwindling and eventual extinction of the Ents. It's a reality that faces some species today, such as this one, a cycad. I'll say the Latin name, but I'll probably get this incorrect. Encephalorhatus woody, which is one of the oldest types. Look, probably a bit like Treebeard's real name, it's very hard to say. One of the oldest types of seed-bearing plants, as the Ents are one of the oldest living things in Middle-earth. They're endemic to a particular forest in South Africa, but without any apparent females due to habitat loss. Like the Ents, the cycad faces extinction if a female isn't found. There's a sense of inevitability about the dwindling and eventual disappearance of the Ents, and with them a kind of disenchantment of Middle-earth. The population of the Ents is already rapidly diminished by the time the story begins, and Treebeard seems to be resigned to his fate. The disenchantment of Middle-earth is not just marked by a loss of individual magical creatures such as Ents and elves, but by an all-pervading transformation of the material world. As Treebeard laments, the world is changing. I feel it in the water, I feel it in the earth, I smell it in the air. I do not think we shall meet again. Fantasy scholar Chris Brawley states that while Treebeard's triumph over Saruman presents itself as a validation of nature and its survival, the Ents' victory is followed by an ever-present hint of despair. Equally, The Lord of the Rings ends in an ecological restoration. Aragorn, now king, promises Treebeard a kind of mass reforestation program, and politicians, as you know, often do this. Coming up to elections, political parties often debate how many trees they can plant compared to the other party. Tolkien can be seen as defying the idea, however, that our modern world will inevitably be disenchanted and ecologically devastated by, I think, enacting enchantment through the texts. We're enchanted when we read them. Crucially, The Lord of the Rings ends with ecological restoration in the face of catastrophe, in ways that motivate an emotional attachment to our own threatened world. I think this offers a vision of hope to many in a time of apathy and despair. That in itself is a kind of enchantment. Agential in the ending of the war and the ecological devastation threatening Middle-earth, was the rousing of the Ents in their march upon Isengard. So after a careful deliberation, the Ents meet and decide in a spark of rage to attack Saruman, who sits in his tower. He calculates the forest of Fangorn as a resource to fuel the domination he plans with a mind of metals and wheels. The Ents go from ponderous preservationists to a kind of radical eco-activists, quenching the fires of Orthanc, smashing the dam built by Saruman's orcs, allowing the Eisen to flood the machinery of war that they've designed as a kind of post-industrial rewilding. It's significant here that the solution is modelled here lies not in retreating into the temporary safety of existing forests, but in bravely fighting to restore what has been lost, a rebuttal against this idea of fantasy as an escapist genre. A critical moment I'd like to finish this particular discussion is when the king of Rohan, Theoden, sees an Ent for the first time. The king was silent. Ents, he said at length, out of the shadows of legend I begin a little to understand the marvel of trees, I think. I've lived to see strange days. Long have we tended our beasts and our fields, built our houses, wrought our tools, or ridden away to help in the wars of Minas Tirith. And that we call the life of men, the way of the world. We cared little for what lay beyond the borders of our land. Songs we have that tell of these things, but we are forgetting them, teaching them only to children as a careless custom. And now the songs have come down among us out of strange places and walk visible under the sun. Theoden's epiphany is a critical moment in the narrative, one that's often overlooked. Upon seeing the Ents, the king of Rohan recognises that the reality he has for so long inhabited has been restricted to the narrow concerns of his kingdom and to the life of man, the way of the world. Rohan's stories, songs and legends of Fangorn, carelessly regarded as fantasies for children, hold a truth that now materialises from under the shadowy eaves to walk visible under the sun. And the line is reminiscent of Eomer's question posed to the wandering Aragorn: do we walk in legends or on the green earth in the daylight? To which he replies, a man may do both, musing that the green earth is itself a mighty matter of legend. The king sees the mundane merge with the marvellous, and the material green earth become the living embodiment, the living matter of imagination. It's through Theoden's encounter with the fantastic Ents he begins to understand the marvel of trees. And Fangorn, deforested and forgotten through the ages, emerges from the periphery of Rohan's history to become its vital ally in the fight for Middle-earth's future, much as our forests are in tackling the ecological crises that affect all life on Earth today. As the wizard Gandalf warns, for not only the little life of men is now endangered. The Ents invite us to consider the role of a fantastic imagination in the shaping of our own perceptions and cultural conceptions of trees and forests, at a time in which we must collectively and radically reimagine our relationship with forests. So that's why I've been taking a group of unsuspecting undergraduate students out into a forest, a wire forest, on what I call reading walks. These are immersive and interactive walks that take the fantasy texts that I've been looking at in my thesis out into the kind of shimmering light of the real forest. So it reads forests in fantasy, but it reads fantasy in forests too. The wire forest is one of the largest remaining ancient woodlands in Britain, just 20 miles south of Birmingham. And the specific place where I took them is a pocket of oak woodland called Ruskin Land. And this is so named because it was the site where the Victorian writer, artist and social critic John Ruskin sought to create an alternative community there in the forest, in contrast to the way of life he saw in places like industrial Birmingham. And the charity he set up, the Guild of St George, which still owns the site, I've been working collaboratively with them, running these reading walks to see how people respond cognitively, but also emotionally and ethically to fantasy forests in situ along a series of these walks through the forest. Here's a photograph of a sculpture that's made from dead wood in that forest, which is aptly named the Dragon's Nest. Probably can't get a sense of this space from this picture, but you have to climb under this archway here, and this big circular space, which kind of invites your eyes to look up into the canopy. And eventually, this is made out of dead wood, so it will eventually rot down into the forest floor. And this is a picture of me reading actually the extract that I read to you earlier describing Treebeard's eyes, and this is to a group of forest scientists at the Research Institute, after which we discussed the role of anthropomorphism in scientific imagination and communication. I'm currently creating teaching resources for secondary schools through BIFOR's outreach programme, such as these virtual interactive reading walks. I've taken a group of film specialists out with 360-degree cameras out into the forest, and they filmed certain locations there. And using a website, you can upload different sorts of media, and that's another way to reach more people. Obviously, I can't bring every school in Birmingham to this forest, so this is a nice way to introduce them to the reading walk. But I'm also bringing A-level geography, A-level biology and A-level English literature students out into the forest, and I'm hoping to co-create some teaching resources around the reading walks. The idea behind this work that I've been doing is that fantastic creations like the Ents may have a powerful role to play in germinating that collective and meaningful engagement with these magical and most vital ecosystems. Thank you.